Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our Zoom webinar, Communicating Effectively, Part 2. We are very excited to be able to offer education during this time of physical distancing. This webinar is being recorded and will be archived for future referencing. Since everyone's situation is unique, the information being provided in this presentation is for educational purposes and not specific advice for your situation. Should you have specific questions about your situation, please contact your support worker for further discussion. At the end of the presentation, we will have a Q&A session and we will do our best to answer all questions. During the presentation, please feel free to add your questions in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. You may need to move your mouse around to see the Zoom controls. Just click on the Q&A icon and it will appear. Should you have any comments or concerns during the presentation, please add those comments into the chat box, which will also be located at the bottom of your screen. Today, we have the pleasure of having a guest speaker back with us, Dr. J.B. Orange, who will be presenting on Communicating Effectively, Part 2. Special emphasis will be on communicating with individuals with various forms of dementia. Dr. J.B. Orange is a professor in the School of Communication Sciences and Disorders at Western University at London, Canada. He is also the scientific director of the Canadian Centre for Activity and Aging at Western University. He is an associate scientist with the Lawson Health Research Institute at London, Canada. I will now turn things over to our presenter, Dr. J.B. Orange. Please begin when you are ready.
Thank you, Dina, and thank you, Susan, for arranging for part 2. Welcome to our multiple viewers this time, some new, some maybe from the first part that I gave, I believe was on the 8th of May. What I have been asked to do is to continue on with material that I wasn't able to cover in the first session. So for those of you who are returning, you must be gluttons for punishment or suffering from insomnia, and I'll put you to sleep. Or for those who haven't had a chance to see part 1, I understand that it's already online, so you can review that, and hopefully that, that will make today's session a little more meaningful. All right, so as I did last time, I have to disclose all of my conflicts that might arise in the presentation. I don't have any links or financial or otherwise with the Alzheimer's Society of London. And I don't have any affiliations with pharmaceutical or medical or communications companies. And the material that I'm going to give you today really reflects the current literature that we have. I also have to tell you a little bit about the grants that I have to show you that I have funded research. Well, the first one is from the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council Partnership Engage Grant, as well as the Ontario Brain Institute on the Ontario Neurodegenerative Research Initiative, the Canadian Consortium for Neurodegeneration and Aging. I also hold a grant from the Canadian Centre for Aging Brain Health Innovation, and one with my colleague Marie Suvananagam on BEPIC. It's an education and training program for PSWs, which I'll talk a little bit about later. Okay. So as we move through today's session, I really want to spend the bulk of the time on strategies to enhance communication. And as Dina pointed out, please feel free to put in questions you have for the Q&A box or items in the chat box, and I'll try and answer those. Likely towards the end, and I think we're supposed to go for about 45 or 50 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. But Dina will be moderating those questions. And what I want to do today is to really focus in on some strategies different from the ones I talked about before, which really were sort of language oriented. And I'm going to talk about quite a few that relate to this wheel. I showed that wheel in the last presentation, but I really only got through this oval right up here on language. And what I hope to be able to do today is to go through many of these other wheels, talking about strategies that relate to cognition. I'm going to start off with that, and then some strategies about how we adjust our speech production and aspects around sensory environments and how we hold a conversation, among other modes or categories that we have in here. So each of these ovals that sit on the periphery of this wheel contain multiple strategies, and I've just tried to cluster and organize them in a way that I think might be meaningful for us. Okay, so let's move forward. Oh, I should point out that you'll see in the bottom right-hand side of your screen what slide we're on. We have 53 slides, and I'm on 5 of 53, so we'll try and get through as many as we can today without rushing too quickly. But again, please feel free to use the boxes of Q&A and chat for questions we can hold. Okay? So I'm going to begin with the cognition. And to remind you, cognition is the term that refers to all these mental activities that we have, our memory systems and processes, our attention systems and processes, our judgments, our reasoning. And we think that cognition really drives language, the words that we use, the grammar, how words link with one another in sentence, the syntax, the order of the words, as well as the meaning of words. So when we think of people who are living with dementia who have a cognitive problem, memory, judgment, reasoning, insightfulness, attention, but they also have language difficulties, and it would be wise for us to think about some of the cognitive strategies that support communication, and I'm going to go through several of these today. So I'd like to begin by just drawing your attention to a couple of new terms, maybe for some of you. One is called autobiographical memory, that is memory that relates to yourself, and it's based on time-based events, that's episodic. So you can remember when your birthday is. Mine happens to be February the 11th, 1956. That's the episode autobiographically for me. But if I were to ask someone in the audience, tell me about the definition of your birthday, that is the meaning associated with it, that's part of the semantic part of your memory system. And for people who are living with dementia, this autobiographical memory, particularly temporal-based, for long-term memories is much better preserved, usually in the early adolescence, early teens, all the way up to mid-20s or 30s. So we want to capitalize on those memories that our friends or relatives can remember about themselves that are event-based and or have some meaning associated with that event. I remember my birthday, the 11th of February, 1956. It has certain semantic meaning for me. I remember my mother and friends coming over and celebrating birthdays in various ways. And so given that these remote memories that are personally relevant are much better preserved in many individuals with the various types of dementia, we want to capitalize on eliciting those types of memories. Now, as we all know from the literature, that our memory of an event or a series of events isn't a pure photograph of what happened, but it is some recollection and rehearsing and small subtle changing of it. But nevertheless, those memories that are more remote in those early teens to early 20s are much better rehearsed and accessed. And so we want to be able to use that from a cognitive perspective. One of the ways of advantaging that access is to use these memory notebooks or wallets for time-based cues. And Michel Bourgeois in the University of Florida has published extensively on this. And there's also elements of the Montessori programming and spaced retrieval training that fit within this cognitive realm. And I'm going to talk about each of these two approaches, memory notebooks and the Montessori program, in greater detail. So conversation or memory notebooks really capitalize as an external memory cue to remind people how to get at this information. And what these memory or conversation notebooks do is through the process of recognizing, that is an external visual cue, we tap into a person's long-term episodic autobiographical memory. And it really is tapping into all of those memories that we've rehearsed hundreds, thousands, sometimes tens, even hundreds of thousands of times. It also capitalizes on the oral reading skills, because part of these conversation notebooks will have sentences typed up underneath them. And what you want to be able to do is to include, and I'll get into it in a moment, these declarative sentences with a picture that is biographical in nature, has some aspects of daily routine, and has some orienting information within the sentence and within the pictures. And so when we think about these conversation memory notebooks or wallets, they're really a collection of declarative sentences and some picture that are designed to prompt the recall of information, and the picture and the words are recognition of meaningful information that is related to the person's long-term memory. And so we can choose, as I indicated earlier, some biography information, some family, daily life schedules, and you can put them in the form of a memory wallet or a memory book, or you can, as I'm going to talk shortly about one of the studies one of my master's students did, you can put them on an iPad and display the pictures and sentences using particular software. So these conversation memory notebooks are really short, brief memory aids that capitalize on this long-term memory store, and they provide some meaningful support like content, semantic, because you've got this sentence in the form of these sentences or words and images, and they help you access this meaningful information stored in LTM, long-term memory. And so the written support for these sentences help your friend or relative recognize the pictures of who they are, and they can remind them of current tasks or topics of conversation, and then participate in conversation. So how do you develop these? Michelle Bourgeois has a lovely book that you can get on Amazon that describes how to develop this memory aid. And typically there are 20 or 30 pictures related to 3 or 4 themes with a picture that could be related to the person's wedding day. It could be first jobs, high school or college or apprentice years. And you want to be sure that the person can see the picture as well as the font that's underneath it. And Michelle has a lovely way of determining how well the person can read the stimuli. And lots of evidence would suggest that the type of font you use in printing, not in writing, is sans serif, without the little doohickeys. The font, for example, that I'm using in these slides is Arial, but you could use Calibri or Helvetica. And if you're typing them out, it's usually in at least 20 point size. And you want these sentences right beneath the original photograph. And you can do this in hard copy form, or you can do it electronically, which I'll describe in a moment. So you want to use information that are facts, that are important to the person that they want to talk about, and the information is important to the caregiver, whether it's a family caregiver or a PSW or healthcare aide or a grandchild. You want to use sentences that have short MLU. Sorry, I'm a speech pathologist, we use a lot of acronyms. MLU means mean length of utterance. That is the number of words in a sentence. If for someone in the early clinical stages of a dementia, it's usually 12 to 15 words. If they're in the middle or later clinical stages, you only want to use sentences that have 8 to 10 words in them. And you want to use, again, another acronym, simple, active declarative sentences. That is sad sentences, not emotionally sad, but in which there is a verb in the present tense. So in this example, Dean and Miriam go grocery shopping on Mondays, and it may be a picture of Dean and Miriam as they go grocery shopping. The other one I like to use is Bob and Margaret in Cuba, 1954, that shows Bob and Margaret on a vacation in 1954, and that sentence is printed in uppercase and lowercase, either on a white sheet, if it's hard copy, with the picture above it, and it's never the original picture, it's always a copy of it, because you never want to use the original. Or if you're going to use it in an iPad or computer, you have it typed beneath the picture in uppercase and lowercase with the photograph there. And so you want to use your friend or relative's vocabulary. How would the person say the sentence, and how might it be in this active present tense? And you can use photographs, adjusted pictures, and you can, if electronically, you can expand them or contract them in any ways you want, okay? So part of the purpose of these conversation memory notebooks, as I alluded to earlier, is to, one, create a conversation, but to choose material that's autobiographical, that is personal, that is time-based for them, and has some meaning for them. And you, as part of the conversation, which I'm going to get to shortly in this session today, you want to ask the person, let's have a conversation. I want to talk about topics that are meaningful for you. And by giving some of the nonverbal aspects of your communication, because you're smiling and you're acting interested, you're thanking the person for talking with you. And you don't want to turn this reminiscence or review of these pictures into a Q&A where you're already asking them for information you know. You want to have the person do most of the talking, not you doing most of the talking. And so part of it is not about trying to get the accuracy of the words in the correct order or reading it aloud. If they paraphrase it to some degree, that's great, because what is the purpose? What is your agenda? One, to have an interaction. Two, that's supportive through nonverbal and speech, as well as eye gaze and contact. And also to stimulate the retrieval of these memories through these external cues, the picture, as well as the simple active declarative sentence that's directly below. So what I want to do now is just transition to a study that Kelsey Dines, one of my former master's students, and I, along with my colleagues Marie Suvendragam and Laura Murray, did on using this concept of an external memory aid of a conversation memory notebook within the context of an iPad. And so Kelsey developed these 3 questions relative to her thesis, and used it in the context of an iPad. So does the collaborative use of this electronic conversation memory notebook increase what is called person-centered communication? And person-centered communication is language that involves negotiating, that is giving people turns, validating people's concerns, recognizing them as a person, individual, and also facilitating that interaction. And part of the purpose of the study was to see whether this conversation memory notebook could provide family caregivers and persons with dementia the opportunity to use person-centered communication. We also wanted to know whether any previous knowledge or familiarity with iPads impacted their ability to use person-centered communication, and did the study did they know that their person-centered communication increased after completing the study? So it was a small study. We used 7 persons who were diagnosed with mild to moderate Alzheimer's type dementia with 7 family caregivers, 6 spouses and 1 adult child. We went into people's homes using an iPad and a piece of software called Pictello that you can purchase. I think the last time I checked it was $28 on Amazon. And this particular software that loads up nicely onto an iPad allows you to scan photographs. And you can see down here that we've scanned 2 of the puppies from participants in our studies. That is my research coordinator and Kelsey's family pet. And underneath it, they typed in the sentence, "The dogs play at the park." So we had 20 baseline and 20 intervention photographs. So people got their performance evaluated on these 20 pictures and sentences. And then we did 20 intervention pictures over the course of using this Pictello program. During the 6-week study, the first week was gathering information on people's cognition, vision, and hearing. And then we gave them a questionnaire on what they knew about iPads and how to use person-centered communication. We then, after getting this baseline information, gathered their performance on 20 family photos that were randomized to the baseline as well as the treatment. And people interacted with these pictures 2 to 3 weeks without even really being trained on any of these strategies. In week 3, we trained them how to use person-centered communication strategies and how to create these simple active declarative sentences. And they did. As a matter of fact, many of the people living with dementia actually helped craft the sentence, and they audio recorded the sentence on the screen. When they touched the picture, they could hear their own voice say, "Bob and Margaret in Cuba, 1954, or whatever it was that they generated that. In weeks 3 to 6, they practiced this. Recordings were collected every 2 to 3 weeks, audio recordings of them interacting. And at the end of the 6 weeks, we then gathered the information on the second questionnaire on the iPad use and their perceived knowledge of these person-centered communication. So what did we find? This graph shows that over the period of time from baseline over weeks 1, weeks 2, weeks 3, and weeks 4, that's the x-axis, and on the y-axis here is the use of these person-centered communication. So 40% of the time, 45, 50. This pink line at the bottom represents the person with dementia, and this blue line represents the family caregivers. And you can see that from the beginning of the study, people who were living with dementia used person-centered communication less than 40% of the time, but at the time they were done, they'd increased by 5%. Not a huge amount, but look at the difference here in terms of the family caregivers. They went from about 52, 53% all the way up to 56, 57%. And they rose to that level pretty quickly. And what this showed was that the persons with dementia didn't use it as much as the family caregivers, but indeed they were using it throughout the course of their interactions. And it improved substantially in a very short period of time. Really by week 2, week 3, they've reached the maximum of the use of these strategies that we taught them: facilitation, negotiation, recognition. And so what we found was there was no significant change in the iPad knowledge. So this increase in the use of the person-centered communication wasn't because they got better with the iPad, but there were significant changes in their perceived person-centered communication knowledge. That is, both the persons with dementia as well as the family caregiver said over the course of the study, they learned more about how to use negotiation, facilitation, validation, etc. And it was statistically significant, even though it didn't go up a whole lot on that graph, but it was statistically significant. What we also found was that there was a beneficial way to promote meaningful engagement between these family members, 6 spouses and the daughter. And so what we also found was that family caregivers play a primary role in self-identity. That is, they were using words that helped brought out the person who had dementia. And clearly the family caregivers don't face any cognitive impairment, so it's up upon us as family members to try and be the catalyst to bring these strategies to help have our family members engage in these meaningful interactions. And that the active engagement, education, and training really occurred over a period of time. It takes some time, but they reached an asymptote pretty quickly. What we also found in the study was that persons with dementia are still able to learn new information. I've been giving talks to family caregivers such as yourselves and professional caregivers for many decades. And when I first started out in this area of research back in the early to mid 1980s, we really felt that persons with dementia could learn, but we're now gathering lots of information, especially over the past 15 or so years, that persons with dementia can learn. And clearly the evidence of this study showed that they were able to learn. And what the lines on that graph show is that there was some harmonious relationship. That is, the slope of the lines is fairly similar between the two groups, so that as the family members got better, so did the person with dementia. So that means that this harmonious or coupled link relationship means that as much as what we have has an impact on our friend or relative with dementia, what they say also has an impact on us. And again, reinforcing the notion this dyad or this couple is absolutely crucial in enhancing communication. We felt that maybe the iPad could have impacted the ability to apply person-centered communication, but people felt that their knowledge of iPad and their knowledge of person-centered communication wasn't really linked to the iPad use. And so both the proportion and the increase and the perceived increase of both knowledge and iPad and person-centered communication improved over time. So we thought this was a very successful intervention. Okay. So that's the iPad, and I would encourage you to use that. I'm using that with family and friends as well as other participants in studies, and it's very useful. So I would encourage the use of these of the Pictello software and or hard copy if you don't have the iPad use as well. Going back to the wheel and talking about other strategies for cognition, I want to make sure that people are reminded that to have a conversation, to communicate with someone who's a relative of ours with dementia, you want to get them to be attending to what you say. So I call these alerting devices, or you have to get their attention, because part of the process of dementia means that we also have a slowing down of how we think and how we process information. And oftentimes people will jump in very quickly with a conversation and ask a question or make a statement, and the person with dementia might be 2 or 3 seconds behind us. So in order for us to be able to optimize that interaction and not have to repeat ourselves or rephrase it, we want to get person's attention by calling out their name, using a touch appropriately, getting down to their level if necessary, getting eye contact, making sure they now see that you're going to communicate with them, and that brings all the cognitive skills and resources up and focuses their attention. Part of the cognitive issues also relates to how well they can attend to you and minimize other distracting information. And I have here, you want to eliminate distractions and noise across all senses, not just auditory noise, but visual noise, olfactory noise. Things don't smell very well, or you have a kitchen that's aroma full of beef stroganoff or something that may be distracting the person because she or he is hungry. So you want to make sure you're in a context where you've got their undivided attention. Other strategies that are cognitive related relate to the idea of reality orientation. And there's no evidence in literature to suggest that bringing our friend or relative to the here and now and reminding them or having them tell us what day or time or place or location in any way facilitates optimal communication. And so the desire for people to say, I want my mom or my dad or my husband or wife here now with me, may be inappropriate under certain conditions, because reality orientation in the evidence really doesn't enhance or optimize communication. Another cognitive strategy is called reminiscence therapy, and reminiscence is really a type of recalling long forgotten information in it, and where there's emphasis placed on long-time experiences, and that is the sort of the autobiographical episodic memory that we talked about before. And allowing a person to reminisce gives that person with dementia control over the conversation, improve their self-esteem because they feel that they're able to talk about information that has personal relevance for them. It may bring some relief from the boredom of lack of stimulation. It may even bring some relief from depression and increase spiritual well-being. There's lots of evidence that reminiscence therapy provides an opportunity for professional caregivers to become active listeners, because communication is not always about you talking to them and them talking to you. Sometimes it's a matter of just being an active listener and doing what we call in our professional world back channeling. That is the oh yeah, I understand. That sounds interesting, to show that you're interacting with them, because that then affirms personhood, that allows them to maintain some control over the interaction, and shows that there is that dyadic interaction between you and someone else. So part of reminiscence therapy means you might be using books or pictures, like the memory book we talked about before. It might be music or videos, listening to music that people liked from the 40s or 50s or 60s, whatever it was, country music, classical music, etc. It can be done in groups as well too. Some of the day programs that your family members may be going to will often use reminiscence therapy and particular materials. We ran a study out at Parkwood Institute in London, Ontario. That's where I'm from. And we did a poetry group. And it worked very well, where there was collaborations among the people to generate the various elements within the poetry that was actually reminiscence related. So part of this reminiscence therapy really brings out the language and memory skills. It allows people to talk about their employment. And so using the information that's personally relevant for them, that may be, as I indicated, event-based or historical-based, calendar-based, allows people to call on that autobiographical memory that's so relevant for them and create some rich interactions in smaller groups or one-on-one. The other cognitive approach is called simulated presence, where there some evidence to suggest that audio or video samples of family members or personal relevant events in someone's lives, video of a retirement party, can be used to calm people who are agitated. And so you can show those videos, you can have a dub over of those videos on the audios, and really what you're doing is you're creating an environment that's reassuring, because you've got familiar people in a context that has personal relevance for them, and it can reduce the agitation and sometimes physical or verbal abuse that's often seen. There's some evidence for people for moderate or severe levels of dementia, but it may have some positive effect on people with mild dementia. I'll tell you anecdotally, clinically, when I was doing my postdoc at McMaster University, family members were showing or were noticing that the father of the family, who had dementia, was getting very agitated when family members would come in for a visit, and he'd get agitated when they left. And so I'd suggested that maybe one of the ways to minimize the disruption in the routine that the father reacted to was to have his spouse, the wife at this point, put on family videos prior to when family members would arrive. So the father sat in front of the television and played and saw the family videos that were on. And so it was as if it were ramping him up to the visit by his daughters and sons-in-laws. And then when they knew when they were leaving, they'd put dad in front of the television again, play the video. And as they got out of the house and made the exit, and it wasn't creating lots of anxiety. So that anecdotal, but there's plenty of evidence in literature that does actually work. Another aspect that I would have not have talked about 20 years ago is this concept called spaced retrieval training. And I'm not going to give you all the details of it because it's very academic at this point, but it is a training protocol that shows that people with dementia can learn, and it can learn meaningful information. And spaced retrieval is really on expanding rehearsal techniques, that is saying the same thing over and over again. And what you're doing is you're increasing the amount of time between when you want the person to give you the response, either a verbal response or a behavioral response. And what it does is it capitalizes on errorless learning. That is, you don't allow the person to make a mistake. And it can be time consuming, but it is a protocol in which you have the person read a card or do a particular task over a longer period of time. So for example, if your mom or your dad is asking you constantly, when do I need to go to the doctor? And you say, well, the doctor's appointment with Dr. Martin is on Wednesday at 3 o'clock. And they ask you again in 3 or 4 minutes, when are we going to the doctor? And you have to repeat the same thing. What you can do is train them through spaced retrieval training to use a card that's placed in a pocket that says Dr. Martin's appointment is Wednesday at such and such a date. And you train them over longer period of times to go, when you ask that question, say, check your coat pocket, and they will go and look at that. And if they begin to say, oh, when is Dr. Martin's point? Yes, I have to go. And they then will go and pick out the card from their pocket and read that. And it takes some time to do this, but it actually works very well. I'm going to shift now from the cognitive areas and move further along the outer rim of this wheel into the speech production domain. And what I mean by speech production is not the words that you use, it's how you make the words, the articulation, the clarity of your speaking. And there's plenty of evidence that speaking at a normal rate, which is about 150 to 180 words per minute, which is not what I'm giving you in this lecture, but 150 to 180 words per minute is about a speech rate, something like this. It's about 2.5 words per second. If you go too slowly, then our relatives and friends can't remember the information you said before. If you go too quickly, like I often do, then they're not able to pick up all that information. We also want to, besides the speech rate, adjust your pitch and have your pitch a little lower or at normal levels. As we age, our hearing for high frequency sounds like s, f, ch, th, are not as good. And so the speech sounds that are in the lower end of the speech spectrum, sometimes the vowels and the consonants like d, b, g, are better heard. And so by dropping our pitch a little bit, we increase the amplitude of those sounds, and so people can hear them very well. In addition to a slow rate or normal or lower pitch, we also want to use stress to stress important pieces of information. So I can change 2 words from noun to verb, record, record, just by changing, same word, but just changing stress patterns on that. And by using pauses where we chunk information that allows people to process that information in smaller chunks, that allows our friend or relative who may have a hearing problem or an attention issue or difficulty processing the language to get caught up in what you're saying, digest it, and then understand it or give you a signal that he or she doesn't understand. Interestingly enough, many of these strategies are for us. This last one I've gotten down here is for a friend or relative to have them sitting up or standing rather than a lying down position, because in the lying down position, you get as much breath support. And if our friend or relative with dementia has some difficulty getting loud, you want them to be sitting up a little bit to some degree to give that breath support for their clarity of articulation. From a nonverbal, it's the next oval on the wheel, we want to be sure that our nonverbal skills are calm, non-threatening, inviting, so that we have facial expressions, eye contact that is culturally appropriate, because there are certain cultures for which eye contact is not appropriate, or excuse me, is appropriate, and they don't want to be looking at you in the eye, and they show some deference or politeness, and so we have to be cognizant of age and sex influencing variables in some of these nonverbal skills. There are also considerations of matching your nonverbal skills with the speech and language, particularly speech and language that is person-centered, not elder speak. And elder speak refers to secondary baby talk or patronizing talk. And so talk that is demeaning or demoralizing. Words such as honey, sweetie, dearie, unless that's the way you normally interact with one another. Words that show that you wouldn't know how to do that, would you? Negative terms that don't really enhance personhood. And so we want to make sure that as we have supportive person-centered communication, we have strategies that are matched with our nonverbals that show inviting interactions, asking to sit on the edge of a bed, getting down to people's level, sort of crouching at a chair, using appropriate touch, starting distally rather than coming in for the big hug. And so we want to make sure that we have the nonverbals that are appropriate and that they also match with spoken, because we can also show very good nonverbals and bad language, or bad nonverbals and good language. So how are you today? But really not show hands on hips and clock watching, and not really show that we're engaged in that individual. Moving further along the wheel, we have some sensory considerations, and I use sensory both for hearing, vision, and tactile. And so you want to make sure that your husband or wife or family member, immigrant, have their eyes checked, their hearing checked, make sure that they can smell appropriately, And there's lots of supportive devices for glasses and hearing aids, personal amplification devices. One of them is called pocket talkers. It's not really a hearing aid, but it amplifies the voice, and that can be very useful. You can get devices that connect to the television, that go directly into the hearing aid if someone likes to watch a lot of television, or can connect Bluetooth into computers. For radio, if someone is really interested in hearing the news or news channels or music of some sort. The audiologists can help you with the vision. Of course, the optometrists, opticians can help you with the vision component, whether it's magnifying component, make sure they're right glasses and they're clean and an up-to-date prescription, because we've known for quite some time the link between hearing loss and vision loss and the exacerbation or making dementia worse. And certainly people who have hearing problems are at a greater risk of even having dementia. It's one of the most modifiable risk factors. So we want to make sure that people can see and hear and interact with their environment through multiple sensory perceptions. I've indicated here at the bottom some data around how to interact with or how to use hearing aids, and there are lots of new ones. You get remotes to control the sounds. Some hearing aids still have settings for microphone, telephone off, or noise suppression. I just remind people that hearing aid batteries don't really last all that long. The average can be 10 to 14 days, because remember, if the hearing aid is on, it's working potentially for 15 to 16 hours a day, or sometimes it's 24 as they've taken them off and putting them in the night table, and they're still on, so it's draining the batteries. So I want to make sure that the batteries are working. And again, I would urge you to get in touch with your audiologist or hearing aid dispenser practitioners to make sure you got the hearing aids working properly for them. Okay? Oftentimes it's better to have 2 hearing aids. I know they're very expensive, but assistive devices programs and government support can help offset those. I can't emphasize that enough. Part of the sensory component, besides having the vision and hearing and tactile assessed, we want to make sure that in our interactions we minimize the noise across all sensory modalities, because that's a cognitive consideration. If I'm listening to you as you're having a conversation, but the radio is playing in the background, or for that matter, your back is to a large picture window and there's lots of movement outside with the picture, with cars or birds or trees, then I'm not really focusing on you, I'm focusing on the background. And for people who have dementia, this concept of signal to noise, the signal being what I see or what I hear, and the noise in the background becomes problematic, and they can't inhibit that very well. So we want to make sure that the distractions are minimized and they're focusing specifically on you. Interestingly enough, there are lots of other therapies, aromatherapy, music, taste, massage therapy that can calm people who are particularly agitated, especially for those of you who have family members who have frontotemporal lobe dementia of the frontal or the behavioral variant. And we want to create a calm, soothing environment so they don't get agitated. And part of the other professions of occupational therapy, recreation therapy, massage therapy, aromatherapy, and nurse practitioners will know about what options might be suitable for your family member beyond the traditional speech and language. But for me, I think it's still part of communication, right? Because you're interacting with the environment and you're interacting with somebody else. From a physical environment and psychosocial environments, we have to take into consideration, are there optimal lighting? Is the temperature appropriate? What is the floor like that people can actually ambulate and get down to an area in a long-term care facility or in my own home? Some facilities have the floors buffed to a shimmering green, and that actually can create some visual problems for older adults because they think that the floor is wet. And if they have some balance and gait problems, they're reluctant to go down that hallway and engage with people. So the physical environment can be facilitating, like a ramp, or can be a barrier, like a hurdle or a fence. And so we have to make sure that the physical environments, that is, how far from the room, if long-term care facilities, or in your own home, where people are going to have communication, like the kitchen, and is the furniture arranged appropriately? Again, out of my realm here, this is where the occupational therapist for seating and accessibility environments, but we also have to think about how accessible that environment is from a communication perspective. I've included psychosocial consideration in the environments. It may be such that the people who are in the environment aren't really creating an inviting context to have that conversation, where they're overly punitive and asking too many questions and not really being supportive. So we think of the environment both physically as well as psychosocially. For example, environments where people use a lot of elder speak, secondary baby talk, or patronizing talk, it's demeaning and demoralizing, is going to create a context, a psychosocial environment where people don't want to interact with one another. I alluded to the concept of Montessori-based programming earlier, and so the history of this comes from the Italian educator Maria Montessori back in the early 1900s, and it's really based on a belief that learning can occur in repetitive, remote ways and in hierarchical ways, starting up with something easy and moving something more complex. And so Maria Montessori's based programming, originally developed for young children, can be used for people with older adults. Not that we're treating older adults like children, but the concepts of using staged tasks that start out simple and work to more complex, even in language, start out simple language, move to more complex, is an approach that's well described in literature. Nini Mahendra has a lovely summary of Montessori-based interventions. It can be meaningful and can be socially interactive and involve activities of daily living. And this is where the speech-language pathology world interacts with the nurse practitioner and the occupational therapist and the recreation therapist. The principles of Montessori that work for our friends or relatives with dementia are that you're going to create a context or environment that is meaningful and purposeful, and you move from simple to complex. So it means you have to break down the tasks, one-step command, two-step commands, three-step commands, and break down activities into their component individual parts. And so using real life tangible materials and using listening and vision, tactile discrimination. So let me give you for an example. You're working with your husband or your wife and you're preparing a meal, and your husband or your wife comes in and says, well, what are you doing? And you say, well, I'm making a meal. Can you help me? Will you help me? I'd like you to help me prepare carrots. And you demonstrate, this is how you're going to peel the carrot. You're not going to say, well, we're going to have carrots for dinner. We're going to peel them first, then I'm going to cut them up, and then I'm going to saute them and make honey glazed carrot. No. One step at a time. I'd like you to peel these carrots. Boom. Then when that's done, you say, oh, great, super job. Now let's try and see if we can cut these into small little chips. Here, I'll show you. And then you monitor as she or he does that. Great, super job. Now let's put them into the pan. And then you've got your butter or your honey or whatever you're going to put in there. And so you've broken down a complex task of making honey glazed carrots by having your friend or relative help you with one small step at a time and demonstrating those tasks. That's Montessori. Let me shift now into conversations. I know I'm running short of time here. We're going to go for maybe another 10 minutes, and then we'll entertain some questions. My research is specifically on conversations and how we carry on a conversation, but I have to tell you a little bit some of the components of what a conversation consists of. There's turn taking and how people take a turn. Right, Dina? Right, Susan? I ask people to take a turn. I get eye contact, or I drop my pitch, and I leave a pause. And that's a signal someone else it's their turn to talk. And for most people with dementia, taking turns is not a problem as long as you have their attention and they're engaged with you. The second part of a conversation is the sequential organization, these recurring patterns. That is, I ask a question, you give me an answer, I give you a compliment, you acknowledge that. That's generally well preserved in people with dementia. So this turn taking and knowing how to respond to questions, again, assuming that they've got the cognitive skills all set, not a problem. But what it becomes problematic is what it is you're going to talk about with people with dementia. And a study by ICCAN says that most people with dementia want to talk about their family members, their awareness of their cognitive problems. They wanted to talk about topics that are humorous, and talking about the fact that they repeat themselves, and also to talk about spiritualism or religion and faith and some of their own usefulness. And that comes from 20 participants with dementia. These are some of the topics they want to talk about. And oftentimes we come into a conversation thinking, oh, I'm going to tell you about all my work today or what happened while I was out. And so we then impose sets of topics that don't necessarily align with their needs or values. And that, again, comes from the work of Michel Bourgeois and the conversation memory notebooks, where we're choosing topics and stimuli that are relevant for them. So part of it is relinquishing the lead and trying to follow. Even though we may not know where the topic is going, we're just allowing them to have their personhood expressed through these topics. Colleagues of mine, Linda Garcia and Yves Joinette, Michel Mentis in the States, also talked about how we access these episodic memories, which I talked about earlier, these event-based memories. and some work done by some students in my lab many years ago examined mealtime conversations where most of the talk was around the context in which the world in which the person was experiencing. We also found that open-ended questions were useful for conversation. That's Ruth Tappan in the United States. So if you don't really care where the topic's going to go or the actual accuracy of the topic, then you can ask open-ended question. An open-ended question might be, so how was your day? Or what do you think of the latest on this COVID pandemic, this virus? And an open-ended question then allows the person with dementia to respond. And open-ended questions can be useful at times. Sometimes they're not very useful. And part of that is your judgment, depending on what agenda you have for the interactions for you and your relative. We know that when you change one topic to the next, that can be problematic, especially for those who are in the middle stages of Alzheimer's type dementia. This comes directly from the research we've been doing. When you introduce a topic without sort of giving the background and you switch very quickly, that can become very problematic. So you have to bridge those topic shifts from one to the next and make it explicit. Okay, Mom, we're not talking about politics now. We're going to talk about dinner tonight. That is what we're going to eat for dinner. And you've made that shift. And we know that when you reintroduce a topic, can be problematic for those in the early and middle stages of Alzheimer's disease because you assume that your friend or relative is remembering what you've talked about earlier. And so reintroducing through phrases such as, do you remember we were talking about that earlier? Puts a lot of pressure on your friend or relative. So you want to try and avoid starting questions with, do you remember? Well, they can't remember very well because they have dementia and cognitive impairments. So we don't want to highlight that for them. At the same time, we're cognizant that they have these memory difficulties, so there's no point in testing them with that type of question. When you have misunderstandings, this is the fourth component besides turn-taking, sequential, and topic management. When you have misunderstandings in communication, that is, people don't understand, the types of cues that you use should lead them to what you don't understand. Friend or relative says something, you don't say, huh, or what, or or pardon me, because that often will elicit straight repetition. But if you said, do you mean blah, 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 blah? That allows your friend or relative to recognize where your problem is and say yes or no. But if you say what, or pardon me, that just puts it back on them to reformulate and recreate their answer that you already had problems with in the beginning. So it doesn't let them know what you misunderstand. So it's better to give these cues that really helps. And if your relative or friend asks you to, I'm not sure what you mean by that, you can either repeat, but you want to repeat with some stress on particular words, but more importantly, some work from my colleague Elizabeth Rochon or her colleagues at the University of Toronto, you want to paraphrase or use synonyms, rephrase it. Don't say it exactly the same way and make sure that you've got their attention before you launch into the repair. And so using the elaborations where you add new information can be problematic. So you want to use synonyms or rephrasing. That can be very helpful. Finally, if you can't figure out what they're saying after 3 tries, what do you mean by that? Do you mean such and such? I'm not sure. Could you tell me that one more time? And if your friend or relative can't understand what you've just said or written, then what you say is, I'm sorry, obviously I can't make it clear for you. It's my fault, and we'll move on. I call that the baseball strategy. 3 strikes and you're out. That is 3 strikes, 3 attempts at trying to figure out what the problem is, and then just admit that it's your fault, even though it may not be your fault at all, and then move on to the next topic. Say, all right, if that's important enough, we'll come back to it, but let's move on to something else. Okay? There are many medications, this is another wheel, that will impact communication, and by no means am I suggesting stop the medications that your doctors prescribed, but just know that certain sedatives, antidepressants, anxiolytics, and antipsychotics have impact on communication in that they may influence anxiety levels, may influence memory issues, sometimes designed to enhance it. Other times it may be creating a sedative effects, and so they're not fully attending. And so we have some issues around attention systems and processes. Some anticoagulants, some antihypertensives, and some of the narcotic-based analgesics may also lead to some challenges with speech production. And so the communication, which includes speech and language and hearing, all these other features, may be influenced by medications. And that means talking to your pharmacist, talking to the nurse practitioner, talking to the physician about what might be side effects related to these medications that are fully well intended to be useful, but maybe in concert with other drugs or in and of themselves may be creating some challenges with cognition or language or speech production. The next oval I want to talk about is emotions. And of course, we often get frustrated with ourselves or with others, and that gets manifest in the way in which we speak, the speech components of it. And so we want to make sure that the way in which we speak and our nonverbals create a calming environment. There's lots of evidence in the literature that even for our friends and relatives who are in the middle or late clinical stages of the disease, may not understand everything that we say, but they can pick up when your face is showing anger or frustration, or your body posture is showing impatience. And so we need to be very careful about how we present that. Similarly, we also have to be very careful about when our friends or relatives get a little upset and then become demanding. I need to see my wife, husband, you're not my wife, I need to go home, this is not my home. And then we may fall into the trap of reality orientation. Yes, this is your home. It has been your home for 47 years. It's a lovely home. And so we have to be very careful. And when we feel our patience thermometer rising, we have to disengage and recognize that we don't want to say words or show behaviors that might otherwise upset our friends or relatives, even more so than they're already agitated. So we have to be very careful about the emotional components in which we create and match in our interactions. We can validate their feelings of anxiety, frustration, and ours as well too, and know that in this compassionate way, which is empathy with some action, we're going to say to our friend or relative, I understand how difficult it is for you. You may have some challenges understanding what I'm saying, and I get frustrated as well too. And so having those cathartic moments where you acknowledge his frustration and your own as well, because this is a dyad, they're linked together, can help diffuse a situation quite dramatically. If there are pieces of information you don't want them to know, don't say it in front of them. Even though you might think, well, I can't hear another word, they're in another room, don't say it if you don't think that's appropriate, okay? And you want to be the comforter, not the bad guy. You want to soothe rather than provoke, okay? I approached the topic of gender a little, with a bit of caution. Men and women talk very differently. Men tend to be very direct. Women use indirect questions, and our friends or relatives with dementia are not going to understand indirect questions. Women often use modals, could, should, might, and using tag questions creates some confusion. So what we want to be able to do is to be up, clear, and in front with their friend or relative, giving them statements of fact, and not, we don't want to be impolite, but at the same time, if we're so impolite, they're not sure what it is we're asking, it becomes an indirect request. And so we just have to be cautious about how we structure the questions in such a way so they understand exactly what it is we want them to do, or we want them to say, or we want them to try and be together with us rather than being obtuse or indirect. There are a number of communication enhancement training programs that speech-language pathologists have developed over the years. I'm just going to give you examples of some of them, and these are communication training programs for family caregivers, for nurse practitioners, nurses, physicians. We're working on one right now called Be Epic for personal service workers. And most of the programs, like the Focus program by Danny Rivich and others, really focus in on the relationship between memory and the importance of communication and depression. And there are cultural components that go in with communicating with older adults who have dementia. And these are, the acronym FOCUS stands for strategies in each of these various categories, maintaining face-to-face, continuity of staying on the topic, maintaining interactions. And so there's lots of evidence to suggest that these training programs work very well. The goals of the program are really about increasing the knowledge and the communication skills. Some of these programs have quizzes or modules. Mary Jo Santopietro and Elizabeth Ostuni in New York had these programs where they trained people how to communicate with older adults, much like I'm educating and training here today. And so we've we've seen the development over the past 20 or 25 years of these education and training programs that I think can be very useful for older adults. My colleague Jeff Small at the University of British Columbia developed the TRACE program, in which they have these compensatory strategies, again, capitalizing on the evidence in the literature, using one idea at a time, redirecting on cue cards for repetitions, eliminating distractions, not suddenly shifting the topic. You'll see some common themes across these programs. Repeating when necessary, but also using paraphrasing. Besides the compensatory strategies, there's also the connecting strategies. You encourage, you invite, you assist, you support the conversation, you link up, you expand, use positivism. That's all part of the late Tom Kitwood's person-centered communication. And so Jeff's program, along with Danny Ripich's and the others, really are designed to, one, improve your education about what your friend or relative can or can't do, and then to develop some knowledge about some strategies that would be useful around the topic, around the cognitive issues, to enhance that personhood and that interaction with them. The other program I mentioned earlier is called the B-EPIC. It's a person-centered communication program where we educate and train program for personal service workers. Marie Subbanagam and I are working on this one. There are other programs that people have developed through activities of daily living. The breakfast clubs, for example, Boschko and Mary Jo Santo Pietro and Jeff Small did this, where you capitalize on the rote routines of everyday activities like having a breakfast, and you get your husband or your wife or mom or dad or your bubby or your noni or your grandpa to help you with breakfast, making Eggo waffles or pouring cereal or getting the yogurt in the preparing of that activity. And that's all about the routine in which you then layer on supportive communication strategies. There are lots of other programs. Sharon Arkin's work on exercise programming and how exercise can facilitate communication, as well as using music therapy. And this is somewhat controversial, people using stuffed animal and dolls, or even more recently, a study that's come out where they've used a robot to interact with people with dementia. So there are all sorts of creative, novel ways that people who run day programs or long-term care facility programs can optimize the residual skills of our friends or relatives with dementia through a variety of options that include art therapies, or gardening, or poetry, like we've done before. Okay? As I come to the last slide, there are new interventions that are coming out for cognitive assisted programming in the software, like I mentioned to you with Pictello, but many other programs that might be useful for people with dementia, including cognitive stimulation therapy that Spector and colleagues have developed that actually engage more than just doing word crosswords on computers or solitaire, but really games that appear as games, but really are designed to improve sustained attention, being able to inhibit distracting information, and capitalizes on what we've known over the past 20 or 25 years, that people with dementia can learn, and we can bring out that person through a variety of novel ways that are unimaginable at this point in time over the next 10, 15, 20 years. So seeing that I've reached the end of my slides and we're almost into this as an hour, maybe what I'll do is I'll stop sharing my screen and turn it back maybe to Dina, who can help us with these Q&A sessions. Is that all right? Dina?
Yeah, that sounds great. That was great. Thank you so much for all the information. That was a great presentation. We'll now open the floor for questions. And so please feel free to add questions in the Q&A box. I'll start off with a comment from one of our viewers. It says, I had sent your last video that was on YouTube to a few people and they really liked it.
Oh, okay. Glad that worked.
And then next one is, it says, I have found with repetitive learning is difficult and seems to be either it comes to me or it doesn't come to me at all, no matter how many times it is repeated.
Right. So that's the spaced retrieval component. So then my question would be, maybe it's not the repetition per se, as we try and be a Shirley or a Sherlock Holmes and sleuth through the problem here. Is it the nature of the material that you're repeating? Is its salience, its relevance for you? Is the way the repetition is happening? So we have to then say, all right, maybe that particular item doesn't work. Maybe the time of day that I'm doing it doesn't seem to work, because we know that there are changes in people's performances at times of day, depending on medications, fatigue issues, distractions. So the repetition may not necessarily be the problem. It may be a host of other issues like the material, time of day, medications. And so we know that repetition can work in spaced retrieval. That doesn't work for everyone at this point, but we know that for people with Alzheimer's type dementia, it seems to work in a reasonable way.
The next question is, what do you see in those nearing death and how memory is used?
So interesting. As a person is moving towards the end of the palliative care and into hospice care component, we have to take into consideration other cognitive issues like delirium, clouding of mentation, and whether the depression has taken on and set in, and whether the sensory systems are still functional. There is a colleague of mine at McMaster University, Lynn Turkstra, who works with people who have traumatic brain injury, as well as a colleague at Western University who's done coma stimulation. Not to suggest that as we move toward the ends of life we're in a coma, but there's evidence to suggest that even if a person is in some silent, quiet, potentially comatose state, there is opportunity to stimulate those individuals. And it might be soothing music or personal relevant music. It might be environmental music as well too. It may be massage therapy. It may be aromatherapy that can keep that person calm and communicate that we're supportive of them in that context as they're progressing towards end stage before death.
We have a comment that says, this is a wonderful presentation. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. Keep up the good work.
Oh, welcome. Thanks. You're welcome. Other
Okay.
questions or comments?
Any more questions or comments?
JV, it's Susan. I'll just make a comment, and this is for the group as well. Just at the end of the presentation, you mentioned some of the work research around, cognitive training, and actually just for the group, our presenters last week, we had a couple of researchers from the University of Alberta, and one of them, Adriana, spoke to that actual point about some of the research that's happening there. So for those of you who are interested in that topic, that presentation and slides will be posted on our website probably sometime early next week.
Great, super.
All right, so at this time, I would like to thank you, Dr. J.B. Orange, for taking the time out of your busy day once again to present this valuable information to us. We are very thankful, and we know that it will help many people. Thank you to everyone who attended this webinar. When you leave the webinar, you will be asked to complete a short evaluation. Please take a minute to fill this out as it helps us for future planning. Our next webinar is scheduled on Tuesday, June the 30th at 6:30 p.m., The Basics with Dr. Bori. This will be our last webinar of the series. You can register on our website. Thank you so much for joining us again today, and enjoy the rest of your day and be safe. Take care.
Bye, everyone. Thanks
Bye,
for
everybody.
attending. Yeah, bye now.
JV, a quick question that just came in. Are there any apps or tools other than Pictello?
There may be. I'm not sure what those other ones might be. We've used Pictello only insofar as it's got really good abilities to record digitally. I'm sure there are others. Off the top of my head, I don't know the others, but we found Pictello to be very, very helpful. But I'm sure there may be others out there.
Also,
Great,
some
thank you.
additional comments, invaluable. Thank you.
Good. Glad you liked it.
And another one, thank you. Easy to follow, Dr. Orange. Stay well.
Oh, great. Thanks. Often I speak very quickly, so I'm glad everyone picked up on it. Maybe they'll pick up a little more if they review it on the video. All right.
And
Thanks.
just for those who are still on, I just wanted to highlight a separate thing. We have actually next week, we have Dr. Michael Bori, who's presenting on Tuesday evening. You can register on our website. Also, a great podcast series called Dementia Dialogue. It's dementiadialogue.ca on the focus of dementia and human rights, which is very wonderful.
Yeah.
And also on Monday, that group will be hosting a town hall on Monday afternoon. So if you go to dementiadialogue.ca, you can find some information about that.
And we have one more comment before we go. Love your humor as well.
Great. Oh, I'm going to give a plug to a colleague of mine, Dr. Susan Lane, who's a geriatrician, had been here and here in Sudbury, because that's where I am right now for the moment. You might want to check out on YouTube a video that she developed on how to enhance communication. I didn't put it in my slides, I should have. But if you Google search within YouTube, Dr. Susan Lane, Enhancing Communication, it's I think 5-minute, maybe 7-minute video on how to communicate, and it's on a whiteboard, and it incorporates several of the strategies we've talked about today. That incorporates some of the work by Jeff Small and others. Maybe what I'll do is, Dina and Susan, I'll send you that YouTube link. You can put it on. It's a lovely video. It captures, I think, in a nice. It's using these whiteboards, and Gordon Pinson, actually, the famous Canadian actor, is the narrator for that. So I'll send that, and it captures some of the basic elements that I've talked about in today's session. So as soon as I hang up from here, I'll send you that, Dina and Susan. You can post that for them. Okay.
That'd be great. Thank you so much for that. That would be a good addition to your presentation.
I think it's a good valuable resource. Forgot about that. Okay.
No, that's all good. That's great. All right. So I think we'll